Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face. Tell me that you love me, even if it's fake.
The revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. They fought off successive European powers, the French, Spanish, British, to proudly establish their independent republic, Haiti, in January 1804. Let's start at the beginning. December 1492, Christopher Columbus happened upon a large island in the western Atlantic Ocean. It was inhabited by Taino people, which the inhabitants called Haiti, meaning mountainous land. Columbus promptly claimed the island for the Spanish crown, naming it La Isla Española, the Spanish island. Columbus builds a small fort named La Laventure and leaves 39 of his men behind to go east in search for gold. The men mistreat the indigenous population, pillaging their villages, seizing their women, and committing acts of violence. Of course, the Tainos retaliate. The Spanish begin importing African slaves as an alternative labor force to produce the sugar and coffee. So, of course, before the Haitian Revolution began, the tension between slaves and Europeans had begun to intensify. The ratio of slaves to slave owners, the disease being spread, and the harsh living conditions for the slaves contributed to the Haitian Revolution. Many wealthy white men had children with black slaves. They usually granted their children freedom, creating a new free social class called free coloreds, who were half black, half white, or mulatto. There were approximately 28,000 free colors at the time of the revolution. The French influence began in 1625, and the French control of what was called Saint-Domingue, now modern-day Haiti. Saint-Domingue became one of the wealthiest of the French colonies, producing vast quantities of sugar and coffee. French settlers began tobacco production, thus initiating the transition to the plantation-oriented economy. Violent conflicts between the white colonists and slaves were common. Also, all the foreigners constantly being shipped from Africa to Haiti led to the spread of disease to the French. One of the factors that helped African slaves in the revolution was smallpox and yellow fever, because these diseases helped wipe out the French forces. Free blacks and mulattoes began to amass wealth and power. August of 1791, after months of planning and strategizing, there were about 200 slave leaders involved from around the north. All hold privileged positions in their plantations. Most of the commoners with influence and authority over other slaves. Through strategic maneuvering, these leaders successfully unite a vast network of Africans, mulattoes, maroons, commanders, house slaves, field slaves, and free blacks. The Haitian Revolution begins with Boys Come On ceremony. Ready to carry out their plans, the slaves meet in Moulin Rouge to make final preparations and to give instructions. The Boys Come On ceremony takes place in a thickly wooded area where the slaves complete their pack in a voodoo ritual. The ceremony is officiated by a bookman, a maroon leader, a voodoo priest from Jamaica, a voodoo high priestess, and various accounts from that night describe a tempest storm, animal sacrifices, and voodoo deities. However, over the centuries, the ceremony has become legend, and it is important to note that it can be difficult to distill fact from myth. Voodoo, both a sacred dance and religion, was expressly forbidden in the French colonies. Voodoo prevailed despite their efforts. Nurtured in a secret by the colony's first slaves. During European Catholicism and the Haitian Revolution, voodoo played a singular role for slaves. As a religion and a spiritual force, is the source of psychological liberation in that it enabled them to express and reaffirm that self-existence they objectively recognized through their own labor. Voodoo further established the slaves' a breakaway psychologically from the very real and concrete chains of slavery, to see themselves as independent beings. In short, it gave them a sense of human dignity and enabled them to survive. During the revolution, Voodoo brought together desperate forces in the colony, uniting various rebel factions to fight side by side. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Voodoo was widely misunderstood in the rest of the world. Hollywood portrayed the religion as primitive and savage, ignoring its rich history and complexity. Many researchers have misunderstood its relationship with Catholicism. Toussaint Laventure, born in 1743 and later passed April 7th in 1803, was born a slave on the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue. He becomes a Haitian general and the most prominent leader of the Haitian Revolution. In August of 1793, Civil Commissioner from France, Poivero, declares that certain slaves are now free, depending of course their class and rank. A civil commissioner also from France, Sonthonax, issues a general emancipation decree abolishing slavery in the North. More slaves in the colony have their freedom than ever before. March of 1798, the British surrendered their fight for Saint-Domingue and negotiated peace with Laventure. June of 1798, Laventure signs a secret alliance treaty with England and the United States. Jumping forward to August of 1973, Toussaint Laventure made a historic speech to rally the blacks, signifying that the revolution lives on. May of 1974, Laventure abandons the Spanish army in the east and joins with the French forces after the Spanish refused to take steps to end slavery. 1800, Laventure is proclaimed the colony's supreme commander-in-chief. He and his revolutionary army of ex-slaves are the uncontested dominant forces in Saint-Domingue. He begins to impose what is essentially a military dictatorship. He has an army of 20,000 men to enforce his position as absolute master of the island colony. Laventure institutes a new set of policies enforcing the traditional plantation system so that the colony's shaken economy can produce exports for France. This is an extension and reinforcement of earlier work codes imposed by French civil commissioners. The laborers see the policies as an effort to reimpose slavery. They further object to Laventure's plan to import Africans to increase the Saint-Domingue's labor force and buoy its economy. January 1801. The governor of the Spanish Saint-Domingue seized control of his territory to Laventure. To make his achievements permanent, Laventure forms a central assembly to write a new constitution for all of Hispaniola that abolishes slavery on the entire island. Laventure's achievements during his years in power include social reforms, structuring and organizing new government, establishing courts of justice, building public schools. Slavery is abolished forever, and the Constitution eliminates social distinctions of race and color, stating all individuals be admitted to all public functions depending on their merit and without regard to race or color. All individuals born on the colony were to be equal, free, and citizens of France. Voodoo is outlawed, mandatory labor is codified, and Catholicism is established as the colony's official religion. Black slaves, chafing against Laventure's mandatory labor requirements, rejected the measurements through various forms of resistance. October 1801, a massive uprising against Laventure's regime breaks out in the north. Leclerc sails from France for Saint-Domingue. He is the commander-in-chief of France's largest expeditionary army ever, with 20,000 European troops. February 1802, Laventure's general, Christophe, sets fire to La Camp, burning it to the ground in anticipation of European troops' arrival. Leclerc enters La Camp, which is now completely destroyed. He carries with him a letter from Napoleon Bonaparte. Leclerc's inability to defeat Dessalines and his resistance army signifies a major turning point in the war. April 1802, Leclerc makes an offer to Laventure, which will allow him to retire with his staff, retain his army ranks and functions, and retire to the place of his choosing. Laventure, realizing that he can't survive another loss, accepts. As a result, Dessalines is forced to submit as well, and reluctantly joins the French, breaking ties with Laventure in the process. Dessalines is more militant of the two. He holds the opinion that Laventure should have thrown out the French, declared independence when he learned of Leclerc's expedition, which I agree. Dessalines begins biding his time to unite the colony's black and mulattoes in order to finally repel the French. June 1802, Leclerc betrays his agreement with Laventure, of course, deceiving and then imprisoning the governor general. Leclerc lures Laventure to a conference where he arrests him and binds him as a common criminal. He ships him to France with his family and manservants. August 1802, Saint-Domingue at last receives news of Bonaparte's made decree that reestablishes slavery. Black and mulatto officers in the French army, incorporated after Laventure's surrender, break with the French and rejoin the revolutionary troops and Maroon guerrilla bands. Black and mulatto officers and soldiers desert with the French troops' equipment and begin attacking cities. October in 1802, the revolutionary leaders, including Dessalines and Christophe, at last defect from the French, taking with them black and mulatto generals and issuing a general call to arms. In November of 1802, Leclerc dies of yellow fever. Rochambeau takes command as Captain General of the colony, writing to Bonaparte for an additional 35,000 troops to defeat and disarm and drive back the blacks. He becomes known for his ruthless and violent massacres, even bringing man-eating dogs from Cuba to hunt. April 1803, the French troops launch a final effort to subdue the rebel forces. The Europeans are without any money or supplies, and they are forced to trade their munitions for food sold by local women. The troops are heavily afflicted by yellow fever and weakened by famine. May 1803, Dessalines creates the Haitian flag. He rips the white fabric from the French tricolor, with the red and blue representing the unity of blacks and mulattoes against the whites. With this, the Haitian flag is born. January 1804, in Gonaïves, Dessalines proclaims Haiti's independence, signaling the formation of the world's first black republic. He publishes a Declaration of Independence, which is signed by himself as well as Christophe. The colony of Saint-Domingue is abolished forever. The original title name of Haiti is officially restored. January through February 1804, Dessalines orders the slaughter of the remaining French residents in Haiti after promising them protection. The black and mulattoes, most of them former slaves, exact revenge on the whites. As many as 4,000 are killed. They are urged on by Dessalines, who famously cried, "Coupe tête, boule caille," meaning cut their heads, burn their houses. October of 1804, Dessalines crowned Emperor Jacques I of Haiti. May in 1805, Dessalines ratifies Haiti's first constitution. To strengthen national unity and bring together the country's various factions, the constitution proclaims that all Haitians black. The constitution reaffirms the permanent abolition of slavery and that all Haitians are free and equal, and above all, Haitians' inalienable right to land ownership. Upon declaring independence, Haiti claimed a singular place in the world's history. The Haitian Revolution lasted from 1791 to 1804, culminated in the first independent nation in the Caribbean, the second democracy in the Western Hemisphere, and the first black republic in the world.